Welcome, Professor Warwick Powell.
Hello, hello.
Hello, how are you going?
Very well, happy to be here.
Very good. So, Warwick, tell me, how did you get into the world of blockchain?
By accident, I think as is often the case, I was playing around with problems in exporting Australian products to China about 8 years ago, and was experiencing two big problems. One was cross-border payments were a bit uneven and lumpy, and supply chain payments was not very good. And the other one was a growing concern about product counterfeiting. So both of these problems were usually dealt with by two different groups of people. The money stuff was solved, so to speak, by financial engineers and product manufacturers who would make things like supply chain finance and all that sort of stuff. And counterfeiting was a problem that was tackled by customs officers and police and inspectors and laboratories and all those things. And I thought to myself, it seems that these are actually two sides of the same coin, because the flow of funds happens when the buyer is satisfied that what they're getting is meant to be what they're getting. So if you could solve the problem of the data about the things themselves, you should be able to sort the flow of funds out. And so in the mid-2010s, so around 2015, Ethereum launched its public network and smart contracts and all that stuff. And I thought, oh, we should be able to whip up a 6-month project to create a smart contract that would enable us to streamline cross-border payments. That's how I stumbled into it.
And how was so originally you started off, but you collaborated with QUT. How did that come about?
Yeah, so at the time I had already done a little bit of work connected back into the world of academia. And it had been more than 25 years since I had a lot to do with academia. And that work was with a colleague by the name of Professor Marcus Fox. And we'd been looking at things to do with regions and regional cities and that sort of stuff. And we got talking about blockchains and regional supply chains and food systems and stuff. And originally Marcus and I got chatting about a project that we would apply for some funding from, I can't remember which CRC it was, but it was one of the CRCs that was about to finish up.
And CRC stands for?
Cooperative Research Centres, which is a Commonwealth government scheme which connects industry partners with university researchers. And we applied for a small amount of funding to do a little pilot project, and we're actually successful in it. But in the end, we didn't go ahead with that project because there was a lot of argy-bargy around IP and all that sort of stuff, so it didn't happen. But the preparatory work was done with Marcus to scope up something. So another opportunity came to put together a project with QUT and another CRC, and we were successful in putting that together, and that's how the collaboration really kicked off.
Excellent. And what were some of the hurdles and things? Because you said it was going to be a 12-month project turned into 10. What did you come up against?
Look, the first thing was that the technology was nowhere near as mature as you'd hope it to be. And it was very early days. So, blockchains and smart contracts were things that were being experimented with in the mid-2010s, and the technology was quite immature. The second challenge as a result of that was really just knowledge and skills, particularly knowledges and skills that bridge different worlds. So worlds of food systems, worlds of supply chain, worlds of finance, worlds of IT. And being able to piece all of that together in an environment where you're dealing with immature technology was actually very, very difficult. The third challenge, I think, ultimately was the confrontation with real world practices. And there was, I think, an underestimation of the challenges in bringing people on board with being able to educate people about the issues that make distributed ledgers a sensible pathway to go down, and also I think bridging the gap between existing practices and institutions and systems with the possibilities of the future. And we were constantly trying to balance up perhaps two irreconcilable thoughts. One was to try to mold the technology to feed into existing practices and institutions, and the other one was to disrupt all of that.
Yeah.
And we vacillated between these two poles regularly.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think in the end, we've come to the view that it is a disruptive technology. If it is to be meaningful, you've got to be willing to accept that you are in the business of disrupting, and that's a challenging space to be in.
So you didn't end up using an existing blockchain, you created your own.
Yeah.
So how did that come about?
The original work was done on the Ethereum mainnet, and through that process we were able to develop a lot of skills and knowledge around smart contract development using the programming language that was applicable in the Ethereum environment, so the programming language called Solidity. But we encountered practical problems, which was, firstly, the transaction fees were variable. So whenever you wanted to update data, you had to pay gas, which was essentially a fee to computers that were actually competing to write blocks. And the problem was that gas fees fluctuated all the time. And in a business environment, it's actually pretty hard to build a business case when you can't have stable costs. So that was problem number one. And that problem became particularly acute when you were trying to do normal, boring transactions against the backdrop where there was something super popular going on. And the big challenge that we confronted was CryptoKitties. So CryptoKitties was really the first NFTs that took the world by storm, and CryptoKitties caused massive congestion on the Ethereum network. So firstly, you had some congestion issues, but that pushed the price of transactions up. And if you're in the business of doing run-of-the-mill things where you just need dependable, repeatable patterns and timely delivery and stuff, that situation wasn't very tolerable. The other problem was that there were people in the supply chains themselves who were very uncomfortable with the idea that their data would be stored on a network of computers that was operated by a bunch of strangers and anonymous strangers. So there was a lot of unease about that. Now, there's a lot of interesting security properties that come with the consensus mechanisms that get a group of strangers to actually arrive at a common database and maintain that. But if you're in the business of doing, producing beef cattle or making wine or whatever it happens to be, and your business becomes dependent upon the validity of this data, you're worried about where that data sits and who's responsible for producing those blocks. And so in the end, we designed a different approach, which was compatible with the Ethereum virtual machine so that we could bring over all of the knowledges and tools that we developed in the first instance, and rolled out our own blockchain network of computers, which addressed those issues. So the cost issues were resolved because, in essence, it's a private network. So we can manage the cost because we know, the cost of the computational power and stuff needed. And the second thing is that we also require the nodes, particularly the nodes that publish blocks, to be not anonymous, so that people know who is responsible for
it. So it's transparent.
Well, it's both transparent, but also somebody's got responsibility. Because ultimately, I think one of the challenges that we ended up understanding is that anonymous distributed networks are great in many ways, but when the question arises, if something goes wrong, who's responsible for it? Well, it's very easy for everybody to go, don't know, not me. And that really didn't wash in a real life supply chain setting either. So we ended up, rolling out an Ethereum virtual machine compatible proof of authority network and rebuilt the smart contracts that we originally developed on the mainnet and redeployed them in a series of modules that enabled us to have a much more flexible and scalable approach.
Great. And who came up with the name of Smart Trade Networks? So this is the company that runs all this, right?
Yeah, look, I think it just came out through discussions, as we just had groups of us sitting around talking about what it is that we were doing, what were some of the key ideas behind what we were doing. So smart, I guess, was the idea of computers and all of that. We're in the business of cross-border trade and supply chains, and we're interested in the way in which economic actors and supply chains built networks. So the idea of networks between supply chain partners, networks between organisations that took collective responsibility for data integrity, and it ended up, someone somewhere said, "Oh, how about smart trade networks?"
Great. And just to end up, what do you think is the future for blockchain?
Look, the big driver, of course, is what's happening, I think, out of China in part. Certainly not the only big driver, but the Chinese government in 2018 made some strategic decisions around technical priorities, and one of those was to support and promote the development of blockchain technologies in China. And in doing that, it is implementing blockchains and distributed ledgers in many different settings, whether it's in governmental services, whether it's in the legal environment, and of course in cross-border trade. And the infrastructure that's being developed in the context of the Chinese government's overall support of distributed ledgers, I think is going to be the digital Silk Road foundations, if you will, for trade and cross-border commerce that involves China. Now, China is the largest trading partner of 130 plus countries in the world. There's only 195 countries in the world. There are 147 signatories to the Belt and Road Initiative. So all of that tells you that this foundational infrastructure based on blockchains is going to be critical to how businesses and countries interact with each other. So in many ways, like it or not, distributed ledgers and blockchains are going to be a big feature of the world for the next 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, awesome. So we're going to be more open and honest, or keeping people honest with blockchain, hopefully. And there's a future where hopefully the information we receive is true and not false.
Well, certainly I think the transparency component can tackle what we call information asymmetry, which is that somebody knows more than someone else. And when that happens, of course, it's not very good because the person who knows more can take advantage of that. So the transparency helps tackle that and creates a more level playing field. It also deals with potentially another part of the challenge around information, and that is that technically, again, we call it information asynchrony, which is when someone knows something before someone else. So both of those aspects create uneven playing fields and disadvantage for those who either don't know as much or know something too late. So blockchains and distributed networks generally go a long way towards tackling those two fundamental problems that, in a sense, distort the ways in which supply chains and markets work. So that's a very important paradigm shift, really, in how we do business across borders. One of the other interesting things about cross-border transactions is that they often involve strangers, actually. Organisations doing business with other organisations where, you're sending invoices and paperwork and things to someone in the accounts payable department. You've never met them. There's no way that you've got that trusting relationship that comes with dealing with people on a regular basis. So once you're dealing at scale, you're mainly dealing with interactions between, in effect, strangers. And those strangers need dependable information systems because that's actually all they've got to work with.
Yeah.
And blockchains help us deliver more dependable information systems.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you for your time today. It's been really interesting.
Cool.
As usual, I'm always
again.
learning stuff.
All the best with the show.
Thank you.
And all the work that you're doing with the Gold Coast Innovation Hub and the rest of the world that it connects with.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Import, export. Thank you.